And we're ready to start part 2. You wanted to know, somebody wanted to know how you determine the lettering width. And I'm going to go ahead and do that on this before I flip my paper over. You take your pen. Different nibs are different widths. Some of them are very skinny. Some of them are quite broad. I've got my nib collection right here. One of these makes a really big letter. This is a size 1.5 from Mitchell. Each brand of nibs has a different sizing method. Mitchell's have numbers written right on the nib, and it's very helpful. So that is a size 1.5. Meanwhile, come on. Here's a size 5. With Mitchell, the bigger the number, the smaller the nib. I don't know why, but that's how they do it. This would make some lovely, small, delicate letters. That's not what we're using today. For a very long time, my workhorse in the SCA was a Mitchell 4. It's a little bit bigger than a 5. This particular one, though, when it came in my kit, I've had to replace my kit recently. This particular one, whenever I put pressure on it, the 2 halves of the nib go like that, and it messes up. So I'm not using a 4 today. But for years and years and years and years and years, whenever I wanted to make a scroll, I pull out my 4. It was my workhorse. It's what I used. Key break. Now what you do before you make this step at all, or as part of making mock-ups, let's assume that this is a mock-up and we're getting ready to make a scroll. I've been known to make 2 and 3 and 4 mock-ups where I test different letter sizes and different line heights. And what you do is you take your pen and you just make little rectangles here. Come on. And you talk to your pen when it doesn't behave. 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you look, this particular line height is almost exactly 3 nib widths high. That's a period height. That'll look okay. They typically work between 3.5 and 5 widths high. I have seen before, and I've had scribes come to me before saying something about this doesn't look right and I can't tell what. And what would happen is they were using a very small nib to make very big letters. So, for example, a letter A or a letter B. And that looks okay, but it's kind of spidery. You know what I mean? You don't get a very big contrast between your thicks and your thins because the letters are so tall that it doesn't look very bold. Whereas if you shrink that down, exact same letters, only now we're operating, it looks much more dramatic, doesn't it? Your thick looks really thick. Your letters are nice and bold looking on the page. It just looks cool. So very often you can cover a lot of sins in your calligraphy by just making sure that your letters are the right height for your nib. Does that make sense to people so far?
And yes. Zooming on that? Or are you in a fixed setup?
Am I in a fixed setup, sorry?
Is there any chance of zooming on it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, let me, will my phone let me zoom? It's not letting me right now. I'm very sorry. I think I know what's going on. Let me see if I can fix it. We'll take a technical pause here. If you have any tea, does this show a little bit better?
Oh, much better. Thank you.
Much better.
Oh, good. I'm so sorry. Now, I'll warn you, if I get my head under the camera, it's going to cover the entire thing. And my pudgy fingers look even bigger now, but we're good.
It's okay.
So right now we have, this is a line, I call it a line set. When you're on your lettering guide and you use the number 7, I call that a line set 7. I do that with my pencil. This particular one was a line set 10, 7 and 10. There's not really any difference in these except as a matter of personal preference and how much room you have for your text. I like to work small personally, but I've always been sort of fussy and fidgety and prissy about stuff like that. I know people who like to work big and bold, and that is perfectly valid. Go for it. If you have room on your page, it'll look great. Another thing we're going to look at is spacing. Let's turn this. Oh yeah, left-handed calligraphy. There are many techniques for left-handed calligraphy. This one is mine. It's also a great human stupid party trick. I write upside down. The reason for this is very simple. These pens operate with a pulled stroke. For all you right-handed weirdos out there, that is a right to left, top to bottom stroke, which coincidentally is how our alphabet works. I, as a left-hander, work best going right to left, bottom to top, which is why these letters were upside down when I was demonstrating them. I did, when I was a beginning scribe, still teaching myself alphabets, I did 4 months of right side up practice, and then I came across a line in one of my calligraphy books that said that left-handers work best with a pulled stroke, so consider reversing the strokes. So I was still writing right side up, but I went, you know, what happens if I go, come on, what happens if I go from bottom to top? And it worked better, but I was still having a hard time seeing things like serifs and getting them lined up precisely because my hand would be in the way. And then I thought, well, what happens if I just take the whole thing and reverse it? So I took my practice book, I flipped it upside down, and I wrote out one alphabet, and I flipped it right side up, and it looked better than 4 months of right side up practice. Just one alphabet upside down. And I went, well, I'm not looking back. And so I have written upside down ever since. Now, every left-hander is wired a little differently. I know some people who turn the page sideways to write. I know people who recommend using what's called a bridge, which is basically a piece of wood with feet at either end that lifts your hand up off the page so that you can work without smudging your work. I think that's a lunacy personally, but it works for people. There are people who do this. This is painful just to look at, so I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
There are people who use left-handed nibs. There are such things. They're cut at a slight angle, where a right-handed nib is cut straight. If you look at the tip, the left-handed ones are cut like this a little bit. It's just at the very, very tip of the nib. These are right-handed nibs because they're easier to come by and I can make them work. My technique is to write upside down. I just do the strokes reversed, the letters reversed. After enough years of practice, I've gotten so good at reading upside down that I sometimes don't realize that the writing is upside down. I was looking at a friend of mine who was a graphic designer, and she had a book of templates, and it was something about, you know, new art or whatever on the front page, on the front cover of the book, and one of the words was upside down. And I stared at that page for 5 minutes trying to figure out what was wrong with the letters, because I was reading them just fine, and it was not registering in my head that half of what was on that page was upside down. So now we are to line spacing. You're not going to start your letter at this very top line. There, hopefully that's a little bit better. You're going to start on this second line right here. Come on, my pen is misbehaving today and I'm slightly... That is your minimum height or your X height. That's where all your letters, the bodies of your letters are going to go. Your ascenders are up here. Your descenders are down here. Or as I call it, head, minimum, tail, head, minimum, tail, head, minimum, tail. And you mark this with your pencil. You don't mark it in ink, but I'm doing it again so you can see what I'm doing. So when you have that, you're ready to write. The only thing that you're going to want to do, you've kept room in your border for your illumination. You may want to make room here for a capital. I'm going to use a capital P. I'm going to make it 3 lines high. So head, minimum, tail, head, minimum, tail, head, minimum, tail. I'm going to come out a little bit. And that's space for my capital P. Now go ahead and draw it in here just because I can.
Is there a recommended or ideal proportion or formula for doing those big capitals, or is it just whatever you think looks good?
A little bit of both. They look good because they're well proportioned.
Fair enough.
I have seen for the most part, they tend to fill up rectangles or squares. They tend to be bigger than you think. Or people will sometimes make a really big rectangle and then put this floaty, weak little letter in the middle of it. You know, big. It doesn't look right.
Yeah.
I tend to make a rectangle 3 or 4 lines high. It wouldn't surprise me if they were golden rectangles, but those tend to be a touch on the narrow side. So if you want to make it square, go right ahead. And then just go all the way to the edge. Completely fill that space. So we've got our first letter written. Hooray, progress.
Yay.
Choosing an alphabet. That's right, I did mention choosing an alphabet, didn't I? Some people only know one alphabet. That's the alphabet you're going to use. That is okay. Some people are combat scribing, and they're not going to have a gloss. When you produce a scroll, sometimes the words are hard to read for the heralds because these alphabets are medieval and they're a little bit weird. That's fine. What you do is you get on your computer and you type up the text and you print it off so you have something that they can read in court, and you tape it to the back of your scroll. That's called a gloss. If you're combat scribing, you might be doing that scroll the exact same day as the court, and you've only got 2 hours and you don't have access to a computer, so you use a nice readable alphabet. Carolingian is good for this. It's also humanist, which is basically the Italians reviving Carolingian. Secretary hands are pretty good if you like that kind of thing. Those are alphabets that are very readable. Or it could be you're in a hurry and you want an alphabet that's going to be kind of fast. A good Batard tends to be a nice, quick, cursive hand. Secretary is another fast one. If you have time, you can pull out all the stops and be as fancy as you want. So I'm going to demonstrate. I'm just going to write the word proclaim in a couple different alphabets here. You see how that letter height and your line height makes a huge difference. It just looks so nice when you get the right height for your nib. Any more questions so far?
I got a question in regards to the spacing that you use. I know for this one, are you using this spacing because of the nib you're using, or do you base the spacing off of the Kingdom guidelines?
My Kingdom's guidelines don't actually go into that detail. I know there are some kingdoms that possibly do. Middle Kingdom doesn't. I'm going on what looks good in period. I'm going to pull the period page up here again. Now this particular one, your letter height, your lines, and your space are identical. So you're going about every other line instead of every third line. Some time periods, they were spaced a little farther apart. Some time periods, they were spaced a little closer together. For this alphabet, I would space it every third because it gives me room for my ascenders, like the letter L up here, and also my descenders, like the letter P, and they don't crash into each other from line to line. For a more Gothic script, like they call it black letter, you know, the picket fence stuff. Let's go. Picket fences, they're fun. If you look at this ascender barely goes very high at all. And it's the same with the descenders. For example, the letter P or the letter Q, the letter Y, the letter G, they don't go down very far. So you can actually go every other line and it will look just as nice. It will look more period as well. I don't know why my pen is misbehaving today. Probably because it knows it's on camera. So if you look at that's what every other line looks like, and that's okay. That is a period look. There's nothing wrong with that. I prefer to go every 3 lines personally. It just is a little bit more readable, I think, for modern eyes. The spacing looks nice. It's aesthetically nice. I'm going to say nice a lot now for no good reason. The lines end up looking very pretty. I have messed this up beyond all recognition. That is okay. Here's one that's all lined out. That looks very, very nice. We could letter that, or we could skip ahead a bit. I don't know if you guys want to skip ahead or not.
Well, how do you determine, I guess my biggest fear, I have not done any actual illumination. I'm still learning very much, but I'm finding this very helpful and making it less intimidating. But how do you determine how much space you need for a given line or a given word so that you're not squishing everything into?
Partly it's practice, partly it's guessing, partly it's praying a little bit, partly it's mock-ups. Here, I'm going to cover this a little bit with my mouse. This is a genuine award that is going to be going out soon. I'm covering the name of the person and when it was given and all that good stuff, but this is an actual award that I did, and this is the illumination style that we're going to be imitating today. But I did not just, thank you. I did not just sit down and crank this out. First, I did what I call a mock-up. It's an ugly sheet of Bristol board where I sit down, I write my margins, I take notes to myself about how wide things are, I lay it out, I look at things like where it goes out too far, you know, in a couple places. I look for spelling errors that I make, things like that, and I make mock-ups. I've been known to make 3 or 4 mock-ups until I get it to look right. That's especially helpful if you're doing long text, because it gets your muscle memory into the flow of the, it gets your muscle memory into the flow of the words, and so you make fewer spelling errors. If you've already said it 3 or 4 times, it's easy to sit down and write it for real because you've written it before.
Okay.
So yeah, I do mock-ups all the time.
I do it in pencil first and then I ink it.
Some people do that. Some people do that. I know some people go ahead and print it off on the computer and then just put it on a light board and write over it. I've never been very good at working with light boards personally. So mock-ups are my own technique. Different people do it different ways, definitely. And there's not really a right or wrong way. It's just practice. If you look at this particular one, I set this up for the class and I still screwed up down here. Instead of going every third line, every third line, every third line, I got a little excited and I went every second line and I went, ah, heck, and I fixed it. Now, since this is just for class, I'm not going to worry about that. On a piece of Bristol is inexpensive and it's hard to correct. So I would pitch it and start over maybe and just keep it as lesson learned. If you're working on Perg or vellum, you get out your scalpel and you can scrape it all the way off and fix it completely. The scroll that I did had a couple spelling errors and I went, ah, heck. And I pulled out my scalpel and I fixed it. This is, if you order from John Neal, you can get an X-Acto knife at any craft store. Nothing wrong with that. That's what I used for years. Medical scalpel blades cost less. They're surgical steel and they're sharper. And did I mention they cost less? Now my kit didn't ship with the handle. They're supposed to have a metal handle that they clip into and you write with. And I don't have that, unfortunately. But you can just work by hand and you just gently scrape until your mistake is gone. And then you can write over it. It's a wonderful thing. Not so wonderful on rough paper, not rough paper, but cheaper paper. Watercolor paper is going to turn to fuzz and lint. Bristol, it's okay. A really good way to fix a mistake, let's go ahead and do that, is to write over it. Let's say I spelled this word wrong. Let's say instead of seal, I wanted to say really. I will, my pen to behave. Swear. I'll write my R, my new L, and my Y. And now it looks a little wonky, but I let that dry and I scrape away only the bits that I don't want and leave the rest behind. I used to see a mistake, remove a mistake, and then try to write over in the repaired area, and it never worked. It doesn't work well because the paper stays fuzzy, the ink bleeds, the mistake is obvious.
Have you ever tried sanding Bristol?
I've heard of people doing it. I've never really had much luck with it myself. I've never tried it. But again, I work with vellum a lot more nowadays. And so I don't have to worry about that. I just scrape the mistake away and write over it and I'm fine. But this is a really good technique. Write over it first and then cut away what you don't want. And that way you don't have to worry about the ink bleeding because the ink is already dry. Does that make sense for people so far?
Yeah, that's a nifty trick.
It is a very helpful trick. It has saved my bacon a few times. So you've got your lettering, you've got space for your initials. We're ready to start illuminating. I can't believe this is going so quickly.
I'm sorry, I got a quick question.
Yeah.
Since we're looking at this, before we move on to illumination, when I'm looking at your capitals, I see over on like a middle kingdom, I see the capital K is taking up like the upper and then the middle. And then I look down over here at February and the F looks like it goes down below. Is that just because of the alphabet you're using, or is it just different ways and preferences as to how you capitalize?
It's how I learned the letters in this particular alphabet. Sometimes the F goes down and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay.
I'm probably pulling a little bit more from uncial and half uncial when I do this, but Carolingian is an early period alphabet. It was popular around the 11th century, so 1000s, and also the 900s, where uncial and half uncial were more popular earlier than that even. So you're going to see a little bit of influence there. So yeah, this is pretty much because that's how the alphabet worked.
Do we have a repository of the different alphabets that you could start to learn from?
I highly recommend, I'm going to write it down because I can.
Thank you.
Sure. His name is Mark Drogan. He only passed away in 2016. He was not a member of the SCA, but he knew about us and he was tickled that we liked his work so much. His book was called Medieval Calligraphy. Its History and Technique. Now, I will say, Drogan is not perfect. He is an SCA Bible. If you're a member of the Scribal community and you mention Drogan, everybody will know who you're talking about. So it's useful in that regard because it gives everybody a common vocabulary for alphabets. Just a second here. Somebody was holding a book up to the camera. Was that Anastasia? Was that right?
No,
Yes.
that was me.
That
Would you
would be
like?
Drogan's book.
Yeah, I don't have Drogan's book anymore because, again, house fire. It's kind of a pain.
Well, this one is much loved and it's starting to follow.
Oh, yeah, mine was
But-
completely beat up. Absolutely. The thing that Drogan gives us is the full range of alphabets through our time period. He also includes what is called a ductus, which is a stroke-by-stroke instruction list for each letter. The only thing is his ductus tends to be the British example in all cases for consistency, but it's not necessarily the prettiest example. It's just the British example. He does have pictures in his book. He'll say, you know, here's a batard, and he'll show you the English batard, and you're going, okay. And then he'll show you a picture of a French petard or a Flemish petard or a German petard, and you're going, that's so pretty. Why didn't you use that one? So, I mean, his book isn't perfect. And there are others out there, I believe. I don't own this one. I've never owned this one, but I think the name is David Harris and The Art of Calligraphy. And then there's another one. She's a modern calligrapher. She will teach you a lot about the structure of letters themselves. Sheila Waters. She's got to be 100 by now if she's still alive, but her book is called Foundations of Calligraphy. And she's probably the foremost calligrapher in the United States at this time, possibly one of the foremost calligraphers in the world at this time. So it's worth getting her stuff. I never owned it. Drogan was enough for me. I talked at the beginning of this class about using what you have and working with what you know. And I'm a big fan of what I call the lazy scribe philosophy, because you do work with what you have. You don't sink $300 into a kit that you maybe are never going to use. You don't overwhelm yourself with techniques that you're not ready for. This was my only calligraphy book for a very long time. And my only illumination book was by Patricia Seligman. And Timothy Node. Mr. Node is a royal scribe for Her Majesty Elizabeth II. And their book was called The Illuminated Alphabet. Really good stuff. It breaks down different projects by time period. It works from earliest to latest. It teaches in the beginning, before you get to the projects, it teaches how to properly paint with gouache. It teaches, sorry, is that better for people?
Oh, much better.
I'm used to working upside down. Sideways doesn't bother me. He teaches gilding. He teaches how to work with gouache. He teaches how to mix powdered pigments with egg yolk to make egg tempera. I mean, it's a terrific book. It's very well written. It's very well illustrated. That was my go-to illumination for decades. This was my go-to calligraphy. If you have one good callig book and one good illumination book, you're set. I know people who have libraries that fill their entire apartment, and that's wonderful. I make use of them from time to time, but I don't need them. I need these to teach me what to do and how to do what I do. Now that I've written all over this, I was gonna illuminate on it. Where is it? We'll illuminate on this one. Let's go ahead. Does anybody have any other questions? Do we need to take a short break? I am ready to take a tea break, a drink break, and then kick over to illumination if everybody else is ready for that.
Just a quick question. How many, I see that you're gonna have 2 illuminated letters.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a rule to know how many we should have in each scroll?
There are scrolls that have none, depending on your time period. There are scrolls that do it every other line. What I did was I put my, I put my big capital here first, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. I gave myself an AOA for underwater basket weaving, and I awarded myself arms, and without letter hindrance from any person from this day forward, period. Now I can stop, pull out my pencil, and put my next capital in. And then, done this 30th day of February, because this is a fake award, Society for Creative Anachronism, and testimony whereof we here set our hand and seal. Leave space for the king and queen to sign. You're set. I like to do 2 because 2 looks cool. I have done poetry where every stanza got a new capital. I have done it where every capital letter for every name and award and everything else was a teeny tiny capital scattered all through in the text. It really depends on what example you're using, what time period you're trying to imitate.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you scrape out 100% cotton watercolor paper?
I've not worked with watercolor very much. What I find is that the ink absorbs in like soaking into a sponge. And you can scrape away the top layer of that sponge and there will be more underneath. And if you keep scraping and keep scraping and keep scraping, eventually you end up with a hole in your paper. However, if you do this, you do stand a much better chance of being able to scrape away. You may have some faint gray ghosts of the ink that used to be there, but it will be better. One thing I will say, please, please, please do not use whiteout.
No.
I've seen scrolls with whiteout on them, and unfortunately, it calls attention to the mistake.
Yeah.
Because it catches the light, it reflects a little bit, you have this nice smooth matte surface and then a bump where the whiteout is. And it's just, please don't use whiteout. That's my suggestion, my big recommendation to you.
Where do you get your vellum?
I get my vellum from an SCA supplier. His name is David Bianco. He operates out of Oregon. He has an Etsy shop. He has fantastic customer service. What is his name? His Etsy shop, I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's etsy.com/ASOFA. I don't know that that's AS of A or Asofa, or I don't know how he pronounces that, but that's what he uses. There are also other vellum and parchment suppliers. Pergamena.net. If you go to .com, it's some Italian guy who will do fake diplomas for you. Pergamena.net sells very high quality parchment and vellum. Make sure you get the right website. I have made this mistake. Gosh, there's somebody else and I cannot remember. I think that John Neal does also sell small pieces of vellum. I'm going to give you their address too. I've mentioned them several times and there's a reason for it.
I don't know if John Neal still has it, but I know for a while they had an SCA kit where you could get like 10 sheets of the Pergamena
They do.
in 11 by 14.
Yeah, they are 11 by 14 with 2 sheets that are 11 by 13 and a half because they cut a big sheet down and that's what they end up with. And it's still fine. It still makes a perfectly good scroll. The one that I showed you earlier was 11 by 13 and a half. You can't tell. John Neal Books, not John Neal Book, John Neal Books, has an SCA discount of 5%. They don't advertise it, but it's there. If you ask for the SCA discount, you'll get 5% off of your purchase. Also, one of their customer service reps is a baroness in that area. She knows her stuff. They know their stuff. They know that the SCA is a big source of customer for them. They know how to treat us right. It's really, really nice to see. They are very helpful, and if you have questions, you can call them up and they will tell you what they recommend. They also won't send you crappy materials. Like if you order a brush, they're not going to send you a splished out nasty brush. They're going to look at the brush themselves before they put it in the pack and send it to you. They're really good people.